I'm Chance Dorland, and this is In-Depth, an interview program from ExpressNews.com with in-depth reporting and other resources for stories affecting San Antonio and Bexar County. Though voters will use some of the most outdated voting machines in the country amid national concerns about tampering or hacking, elections officials in Bexar County and Texas insist they are confident the midterm elections will be secure. Now, it's easy to see how it might be hard to believe a sentence like that. There's some conflicting ideals there. So to get to the bottom of it all, I'm joined by San Antonio Express News government and politics reporter Dylan McGuinness. So Dylan, great to have you here on the program for the first time. Let's begin with how voting is handled in each county of the Lone Star State, and then we'll make our way to Bexar County.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. So unlike some other states in the country, every county in Texas is basically responsible for its own election system. It's a decentralized process where each of the 254 counties basically sets their own procedures. Now, the state and the federal government do exercise some oversight over that. As an example, there's only 3 licensed companies where counties can get their voting machines from. Those are licensed by the state. But in general, each county basically gets to play by its own rules.
Great. So now we're moving down to Bexar County. They're playing by their own rules, just like everyone else in Texas. You recently wrote that Bexar County voters will use some of the most outdated voting machines in the entire country. So what exactly are we talking about there?
We're talking about the actual machines that voters use on election day and in the early voting processes. So basically, Bexar uses touchscreen iVotronic devices, they're called. Basically, the voter goes in, makes a selection on a machine. The machine processes that vote. At the end of the day, the machine prints out for the poll worker that vote count. So the problem, according to election experts, is that there's no paper record of those individual votes. So the voter doesn't walk away with physical evidence that the vote was counted as he or she intended. And there's no way to do any kind of meaningful recount if there's issues. So in other words, if there was an attack or if there was some other kind of discrepancy, there's no way to recount the votes because the machine is just going to give you the same tally again. And these are the machines that one of the sources in the story compared to a flip phone or a first generation iPod. And interestingly enough, the story actually kind of goes back to the 2000 presidential election, obviously between George Bush and Al Gore, where there was a pretty closely watched recount in Florida. In light of that election where you had those hanging chads and those kind of things, those butterfly ballots, touchscreens were seen as the state-of-art solution to that kind of problem. So many states moved to get them with help of funding from the Help America Vote Act after that election. And then you flash forward to 2006, again in Florida, which apparently is the epicenter of voting difficulties here. These same devices that Bexar County uses in an election in Saratoga County registered 18,000 votes as blank ballots. Obviously, it's exceedingly unlikely that 18,000 people went to the polls to just submit a blank ballot. So clearly something was wrong there, but there was no way to do a recount. So that election, which was pretty important, there was a congressional election in that, or congressional race in that election where it was decided by 300 votes. Obviously, 18,000 votes can swing that either way. So many states after that election moved to ban these devices, these machines. Texas wasn't one of them. Texas is one of 13 states that still use these machines, and Bexar County is one of 148 counties in Texas that uses them. But I should note that Jackie Callanan, who's the elections administrator here in Bexar County, says she is looking to replace the devices in the near future. That's obviously a pretty expensive and lengthy process, but she is looking to do that.
So if you've been only voting in Bexar County while these devices have been in use, you might not know of what another system might look like. So would a different voting machine that had similar technology print something out? How might things be different maybe with these new devices that they're looking to bring in?
Yeah, so elections experts kind of say the best thing you can have is a paper ballot. So basically, you get a paper ballot, you fill it out in pen, and then you put it into a machine that counts it. That way you have the physical paper record there in case something does go wrong with these machines. So that's kind of the gold standard in security now that election experts told me is that you need that paper record to have just in case something happens.
So that's interesting. So that's a different direction than what I was just describing with the question. So very good thing I asked it. So you're actually kind of going back to the previous technology of just a written, hand done ballot, but then it's counted by the machine, and then you have the backup of the ballot itself.
Yeah, you're kind of going old school. I guess the paper old school is more secure, obviously, than new technology, which is interesting. Although I should say there are other processes and voting machines that do incorporate more technology that are also thought of as secure. It's not necessarily that's the only way to do it, but that's one way that's pretty easy for states or counties to kind of move towards.
And so, of course, the big reason, of course, there are others, but the real big reason why all of this is in the news for this upcoming election is because U.S. officials have warned that a situation like the one in 2016, where Russia-linked hackers targeted election systems in 21 states, as well as Texas, is just one click away. This is still in the news. What just happened a short time ago, it's not like we've moved on. They're still debating this. So is there any info you're aware of regarding a possible repeat of what happened 2 years ago? And that could be nationally or, of course, just Texas itself.
Yeah, it's hard to know, and I should say that I don't report obviously on national security issues or the Justice or Homeland Security Department, so I don't know any more than what other people are reading, obviously, in national news outlets. But that quote, the idea that an attack like 2016 is one click away, that comes from Dan Coats, who's the director of national intelligence. He told the Associated Press that. So I think the obvious concern is that it stems from 2016 because just to rehash what happened there, in 2016, the Department of Homeland Security basically came out and said that 21 states were targeted by Russia-linked hackers. They didn't say that in 2016. They said that in 2017, but obviously the election was in 2016. Texas was one of those states. And most of that action, most of that targeting, the DHS said was scanning, which they basically amounted to, a burglar scouting out a house without robbing it yet. So in other words, these hackers didn't do anything in most of these instances, but they were kind of scouting to look around possibly for another attack. So I think that's the natural concern that many people have, is that when you have that type of activity, what follows that? What happens after the burglar scouts a house? Well, he usually robs it. So I think that's the natural concern for 2018, is that something more nefarious could be in the works. But we don't know what that is, or at least the public doesn't at this point. And I should have known there's actually some discrepancy as well with what happened in Texas. Secretary of State Pablos says election systems weren't targeted here. Our colleague Ali Morris reported last year that records showed Russia-backed hackers targeted the DPS in the Texas Library and State Archives Commission. So that could be why Texas is on the list, but we still don't really know what happened here in Texas in 2016.
And so looking forward here, just, counting down until this November election, what are the specific vulnerabilities for the Lone Star State itself, at least the ones that we're aware of that they're talking about when it comes to the possibility of hackers going after this election process?
Yeah, so it's hard to say definitively. And again, every county has their own procedures, so it's difficult to generalize across the state. But what I'd say is there's three kind of categories of concern, which is what I went to in my story. So the machines themselves, especially these DRE machines, which is what Bexar County uses, they're offline. They're not connected to the internet, and that's seen as a pretty good security measure, so that they can't be hacked into kind of remotely that way. Election experts do say, though, that they can still be compromised. There are disks that are inserted in them. There could be malware in those disks. There's other ways to get in, but the fact that they're offline is pretty comforting. The voter registration database, that's a statewide database that the Secretary of State's office handles. That is online. It's only available to people who are authorized to use it. There's credentials that you need to put in to get into it. But security experts say basically anytime anything's online anywhere, it's vulnerable. And in 2016, national media reported that an Arizona election worker's credentials to their statewide database were posted online by a hacker. So you can see how these things are still vulnerable, even if there's security measures there. And then the third area is the poll books. So when the voter walks into the polling site, the polling book system is what the election worker uses to match the person's identification with their voter registration record. There's no state oversight over that in Texas. So again, each county is playing by their own rules, and there's not oversight about certain measures or barriers that the county needs to fill. So Bexar County uses a company called Votech for that. As one of my sources said, they say they're very secure, but there's no way really to know that without oversight.
And then this is most likely going to be a difficult question, but I feel like it's worth asking anyways. County to county, you've already outlined that's a very different process. But Texas as a state, is there any way to tell how Texas is faring compared to the other 49 states when it comes to cybersecurity and election security?
Yeah, so I posed that question to one of the sources we talked to in the story, Dan Wallach from Rice University, who's an election security expert, researches cybersecurity. He basically said he would put Texas in the bottom 13, and that 13 comes from the 13 states that still use these DRE machines. So I wouldn't say Texas is by any way leading the pack nationally, and certainly there's reason to put them towards the bottom of the pack.
And as we continue on, once again, counting down the days until this November election, early voting, of course, is obviously another situation to be considered, but many people just vote on election day. How has everything that we've discussed really going to affect an average voter in the San Antonio area, in Bexar County? Is there anything specific you think that they should take home from this discussion we've had, or anything that we haven't mentioned yet that might be very important to them?
I don't know. I mean, the reason this is such an important issue and why it's one that I wanted to get into is that, really what we're talking about here is the integrity of the vote. It's the idea that I, as a voter, can walk into a polling place and be confident that my vote is being registered as I intended. It's democracy. It's the underpinning of our country. And so that's what I think is at stake here. But I think it's also important not to fearmonger. I don't think, I want people walking into the election thinking anything is rigged or set up. It's just there's some genuine concern on the part of officials and security experts here. So I think it's good for voters to be aware of that. But aside from going in and counting your vote, I'm not sure what else you could do in the next 2 weeks to prepare for it. It's kind of up to the government.
Anything specific that you're looking forward to when it comes to this election? And then, of course, final thoughts before we say goodbye, Dylan.
Yeah, it's going to be exciting. There's a lot of good races here in Texas. The registration deadline has passed, but early voting starts Monday. We're going to be coming out with a story shortly with everything you need to know about how to vote early. So keep an eye out for that. Go make your voice heard.
And thanks to San Antonio Express News government and politics reporter Dylan McGuinness for joining me for the first time on today's episode of the In-Depth Podcast, an interview program from expressnews.com. For the San Antonio Express News, I'm Chance Dorland.